I'm sorry, but I need a divorce. I'm going to remarry your sister, who has inherited my father-in-law's estate. What a short-sighted man. Little does he know, a terrible tragedy awaits him. I am Teresa, 32 years old. I married my husband Steve 2 years ago. We don't have children yet, and I work at a nearby company. We've been living happily, enjoying our time together. Steve's company is run by his elder brother, Brian, my brother-in-law. Brian is quite a capable man. In the past few years, the company's performance has skyrocketed. Starting as a small construction firm, it has grown to become well known in the construction industry. Steve, working in sales at the company, one day secured a major contract for the reconstruction of a major beverage company's headquarters. We invited Brian over for dinner to celebrate. Congratulations on the big contract, Steve, Brian. When I offered my congratulations, Brian said, "Thanks, Teresa. It's going to get busier now. Right, Steve? We must work hard, but don't let your business make Teresa feel lonely." Steve replied, "I know. But I have ambitions. I want to grow my brother's company even more, increase our income, and build a huge mansion on a large piece of land. I need to prove myself to those who look down on me." Steve and Brian grew up quite poor. Their clothes and school supplies were always worn out, and they were often laughed at by their classmates. It was sad that Steve and I had less time together recently due to his work. But hearing his story, I was determined to fully support his dreams. However, during this time, I received shocking news from my father, with whom my younger sister Valerie and I were living. My father was diagnosed with terminal cancer and had been hospitalized a few days earlier. His condition was advanced, and he had been given a prognosis. My father's message was to inform me of his condition and ask me to bring some clothes to the hospital. My family home, where my father and Valerie lived, was about an hour's drive from my house. My mother had passed away when I was a student. I wasn't very close to my father, but he was still my father. After work in the evening, as requested, I went straight to my family home to take the clothes to the hospital. When I arrived at the house, Valerie was there alone. "Oh, sis, it's been a while." "Valerie, it's been a while." I was surprised to hear about Dad's sudden hospitalization. "Yeah." I was shocked too. Suddenly being told he has terminal cancer. I'm worried about how I'm going to live now. What will I do if the allowance from Dad stops? Valerie said such things nonchalantly. Valerie is 28, 4 years younger than me. She claims to be a day trader, but I have no idea what she actually does. She spends all day at home, staring blankly at her computer. To me, my sister seemed like nothing but unemployed. "You're not making any money, are you?" As always. Valerie seemed to be living off our father, claiming to be investing but not actually doing anything. The house was always a mess, and she didn't seem to do any housework. Just lounging around at home every day. "Didn't Dad contact you? Since you live with him, it would be normal for you to bring him his clothes." I haven't been in touch with Dad at all. Going to the hospital is so depressing, I hate it. Plus, it's a hassle. I did get a message, but I made up an excuse and turned it down. Anyway, how is Steve doing? I haven't seen him recently, and I'm feeling a bit lonely. I've been dreaming about Steve every night for the past few days. Wow, I can't believe she can say such a thing. The reason being, Valerie once stole a boyfriend from me. I still haven't forgiven her for that. Back then, after taking my boyfriend, Valerie said, "I mean, it just shows that I'm more attractive as a woman than you, right? It's not my fault. Maybe you didn't put enough effort into making yourself more appealing?" Laughing, she said that to me while I was in tears. Ever since then, I've had complicated feelings towards my sister. But when I decided to marry Steve, I introduced him to her, thinking she's family after all and feeling secure in our engagement. Then, Valerie flirted with Steve, saying, "Wow, Steve is really handsome. Can I have your contact as a sign of friendship?" "Oh, you're not married yet, right? Why don't you marry me instead of Teresa? I'll take good care of you." I was stunned by her audacity. Even Steve was taken aback, thinking, "I've heard rumors, but this is too much." As for our father, he has always favored Valerie, always showing her preference. That's why I gradually stopped visiting my family home. Amidst all this, the news of my father's terminal cancer broke. My father passed away unexpectedly, without even waiting for the 3 months he was given. Arranging the funeral and preparing the grave, I was overwhelmed with all these first-time experiences. I consulted with people around me during these hectic days. Even then, Valerie didn't lift a finger to help, complaining that everything was a hassle and showing no grief over our father's death. I was beyond frustrated, though I had expected as much. But my frustration wasn't just with Valerie. Right after my father passed away in the hospital, I called Steve, who couldn't be there, to inform him of my father's death. Steve's first reaction was shocking. "Oh, he passed away. Sooner than I thought." Yes, it was sudden. When I told him with tears in my voice, he said, "So, what about the inheritance?" "Inheritance? You're asking about that now?" Despite my surprise, Steve continued, "Yeah, the inheritance. It's important, isn't it? Your family home is big, and the land is vast. I'm expecting a significant inheritance." I was speechless, shocked by his insensitivity. A person had just died, not just any person, but his wife's father. To talk about money at a time like this seemed incredibly insensitive and greedy. I was dumbfounded by Steve's utter lack of tact. But then, thinking about it calmly, it was indeed something that needed to be addressed. I didn't want any trouble later, so I decided to talk about it properly. I met with Valerie soon after to discuss the inheritance. When I brought it up, Valerie slapped her knee and said, "Right. Now that Dad's gone, we do have to think about that." Despite her lack of reaction to my busy days, Valerie quickly got up from the sofa the moment money was mentioned. I suppressed my desire to throw a sarcastic comment at her and calmly began to explain. "You know, Dad only had us as his next of kin, right? Normally, when only children are the heirs, the inheritance is split equally between them. So, if there are 2 children, the inheritance should be divided in half. Legal inheritance share? I don't really understand complicated stuff, but you have Steve, who earns well, right? He seems quite busy, and you must have enough income, right? Why don't you just renounce your share of the inheritance and give it all to me? I've always thought it was unfair that you have all the money." As I was appalled by Valerie's brazen suggestion, she continued without hesitation. "Besides, you weren't even on good terms with Dad, right? I think Dad would have wanted me to have all the inheritance if he had left a will." Despite never visiting Dad in the hospital or even being there for his last moments, citing a drama she wanted to watch, Valerie had the audacity to say such things. I was once again astounded by her. But, in a way, Valerie had a point. If Dad hadn't passed away earlier than expected and had the time to write a will or organize his assets, he probably would have arranged the inheritance so that Valerie would receive more. It was a bit sad, but it was easy to imagine that would have been the case. So, I quietly decided to renounce my share of the inheritance. "All right, I'll give you all of Dad's inheritance." When I told her this, Valerie jumped for joy. But I wasn't going to let her have it all that easily. I finally said what I had been thinking for a long time. "In exchange, I have a request." "Sure, what is it?" "Valerie, can you cut ties with me?" I had wanted to disown my sister, whom I despised, for a long time. But it had been too bothersome to even have a proper conversation with her. So I had never brought it up until now. Moreover, I saw my father's death as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. With Dad gone and no one left for Valerie to pester for money, she might turn to me next. I couldn't bear the thought of being hounded by a sister I disliked, so I decided to be clear about it. When I presented the idea of disowning her, Valerie responded, "Oh, really? Well, if I get all the inheritance, I won't have to worry about money." She agreed to it without any hesitation. That night, when I returned home, Steve immediately asked me, "So? How much was it?" "Huh? What do you mean, how much?" Grinning, Steve leaned forward. "You were going to talk about the inheritance with Valerie today, right?" "Oh, that. I renounced my inheritance. So, 0. When I said this, Steve became furious. "What are you saying? How can you be so foolish? I've never heard of such a thing. Normally, sisters split the inheritance. You're just too stupid." "Hey, don't you think calling me stupid and foolish is a bit too much?" Having been insulted to such an extent, I couldn't stay silent. Then, Steve let out an exaggerated sigh and said something astonishing. "Forget it. I'll marry Valerie." Shocked by his unbelievable statement, I doubted my ears for a moment. Before I could respond, Steve quickly went to the bedroom, started packing his belongings, and left the house without another word. "What are you doing, Steve?" "What am I doing? I can't stay with someone as foolish as you. Didn't I tell you I'm going to marry Valerie?" Saying this, he quickly finished packing and left the house without another word. Suddenly faced with this situation, I was understandably panicked. I tried calling Steve multiple times, but he didn't seem to answer his phone at all. For a moment, I thought about calling Valerie to check if Steve had really gone to her. But we had blocked each other's contact information when we decided to disown each other. After calming down and thinking it over, I realized that it was unlikely that Steve would suddenly divorce me and marry my sister just because I renounced the inheritance. So, I decided to wait for Steve to return. The next day, Sunday afternoon, Steve returned home. But I was shocked at the sight that greeted me in the living room. There was Steve, with Valerie, his arm tightly wrapped around her. Then Steve said, "Teresa, sorry, but I want a divorce. I'm going to remarry your sister Valerie, who has inherited your father's estate." He presented a signed divorce paper. "The reason I married you was that your family's house was big, and your father was a wealthy man. Frankly, that was the only reason. If I had met Valerie before you, I would have definitely married her." "That's impossible." I was shocked, not because he was proposing divorce, but because I had been living as a normal couple with such a crazy person. Just the thought of our married life made my skin crawl. Seeing me speechless, Valerie spoke up. "Did you cry, sis? But it can't be helped, right? I'm cuter than you. So, goodbye. I'll pay the compensation. Just sign the divorce papers quickly and submit them, okay?" With those words, Steve and Valerie left the house. I bowed my head. As the sound of the front door closing reached my ears, I looked up. Ha! They fell right into the trap. A smile naturally came to my face. They are such fools. After that, those two seemed to be living in the house my father left behind. I quickly left the apartment, filled with creepy memories of my time with Steve, and stayed in a hotel until I found a new place. It was less than a week later when I heard from Steve. "I've transferred the compensation. Did you submit the divorce papers?" Valerie was with him. "Sis, we want to register our marriage next week, so hurry up and go to the office, okay?" "Understood. Goodbye." I had submitted the divorce papers as soon as I received them. Months passed without incident, but about half a year later, Steve called me again. "Here it comes." I answered the phone with a smirk. "Hello? It's been a while. What's up?" Steve sounded frantic as he yelled at me. "You knew, didn't you? Why didn't you tell me your father had such a huge amount of debt?" It seemed he finally realized it. Indeed, my father had a large house and vast land. But, he also had an enormous amount of debt, far exceeding the value of his assets. Probably. Valerie received some sort of demand notice and finally realized the extent of our father's debts. Don't say things like I kept quiet about it. I didn't have to tell Valerie anything, as she never asked. Besides, talking to her only irritates me. Initially, I wasn't obliged to answer something I wasn't asked. Since I left my family home, I've had minimal contact with Dad and Valerie and intended to keep it that way. Dad was a spendthrift, you know. Mom managed the finances while she was alive, but after her passing, there was no stopping his spending. Plus, with Valerie constantly asking for money, his debts ballooned to an unbelievable amount. That much debt can't be repaid even if we sell this house and land. Valerie is something else. She knew about Dad's debts but had no idea that inheriting the estate would include inheriting the debts. She's not the brightest. Then, Valerie's shrill voice came from the other end. Don't say such mean things. Anyone would think inheritance means receiving money. You're old enough, a normal adult would understand that. As Valerie's voice grew louder, that's so unfair, I'm so irritated. The one who's irritated is me. You can't even do housework, you're really hopeless. An argument broke out over the phone. I couldn't forgive Valerie, of course, but I also couldn't forgive my dad for doting on her. Though I did nurse Dad when he was hospitalized. Out of gratitude for him allowing me to go to high school. Part of me also wanted revenge on them both. That's why I deliberately renounced my inheritance, leaving Valerie with Dad's debts. Sorry to interrupt. But I've already submitted the divorce papers and signed the documents to renounce the inheritance. There's nothing more I can do. Good luck. Goodbye. I hung up the phone and immediately blocked Steve. Half a year later, I hesitantly answered a call from a public phone, and it was Steve. Help me, please. I tried to divorce Valerie right after that. But she doesn't want to work and insists I pay off the debts, so she won't divorce me. I've been looked down upon by relatives, and even had to resign from my brother's company. My brother and relatives have disowned me too. I was fooled by Valerie into some shady investment, and now she's gone. I've been stripped of everything and have nowhere to live. Teresa, help me. Then, a man next to me said, "It's all your own doing." That was Steve's brother, Brian. Brian had advised me on funeral arrangements and the gravestone when Dad passed away. His father had passed away a bit before mine, and as the eldest, Brian was knowledgeable about such matters. After my divorce from Steve, Brian was the one who took care of me the most. Surprised by the unexpected voice, Steve was at a loss for words. "Steve, I'm dating Brian now." "What?" Brian spoke calmly to Steve. "You hurt Teresa so much, and now you're asking for help? That's too convenient. Don't ever bother her again. If you do, even if you're my brother, I'll call the police. I'm hanging up now." "Wait, brother." Just before hanging up, I could hear Steve's voice, a mix of a scream and a cry. After that, I ignored all calls from public phones. It turned out that Steve had been trying to find reemployment, but struggled in these hard times to find regular work. He was living off odd jobs, but his greedy nature never changed. He got involved with a fraud group and eventually got arrested. We saw his face on the news after a long time. Valerie was also involved in a separate investment fraud and ended up in prison. Both of them are now spending their days in separate prisons, reflecting on their actions. Truly, it was nothing but their own doing. As for me, I married Brian a few years later and became a housewife. His company has grown even more in the past few years. And now Brian is the president of a big company. We built a big house and live there as a couple. Brian always values our time together, no matter how busy he is. I spend my days feeling incredibly happy. People blinded by immediate small gains lose out on greater happiness. I hope my life with Brian, the president of a big company who values the small joys of everyday life, continues forever.